new millennium bring everlasting love and peace.
They set off in canoes fitted with sails for a destination dictated by the winds and ocean currents and guided by their knowledge of the stars and the sky. These first Samoans came from Southeast Asia. In centuries of voyaging, they discovered and settled many island groups as they moved eastwards. 3,000 years ago, they arrived at the islands they will name Samoa.
In the beginning, the earth was void and without form, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the consciousness of the Creator God, Litangaloalangi, paused on the deep. And the upstanding rock came forth out of the depths of the sea. And the rock divides, and the rock multiplies. This then is our country, wrestled from the watery wastes and void, by the moving spirit of unending freedom, Letangaloa. This is our country, founded upon God. This is Samoa, the sacred center of our universe.
Since earliest times, Tufutafoi on the most westerly point of Samoa became the gathering place for the souls of the dead. When high-ranking chiefs died, their spirits assembled at Whawhausawali'i, where they descended to the underworld Pulotu through a narrow opening to the sea.
To these shores came new voyagers from the west. They would change this group of islands forever.
The legendary significance of Tufutafoi gradually gave way to the historical prominence of Apia, as it became the center of political arguments and wars among and between Samoans and Europeans. Apia developed into a modern city with a fusion of the old and new. In the 3,000 years since they reached these islands, Samoans developed a culture and a system of values, Samoa. They are still practiced. Samoan culture is a living culture. Divorced from it, one is not a Samoan. It is a commitment which ensures the survival of the culture. The Ava ceremony continues to be the highest form of showing respect when welcoming guests. It is a symbolic way of acknowledging rank and system of honor to those present. Fine mats are the most valuable artifact of Samoa. The best quality fine mats are presented to the most important matai, chiefs. In traditional weddings, the family of the bride provides fine mats for the groom's family, who reciprocate with traditional artifacts or money. The fine mat also plays a unique role in resolving serious offenses, even murder. When a transgressor seeks forgiveness from the victim's family, he quietly goes with his ainga, extended family, to the home of the victim. He humbles himself, covered with a fine mat, and will remain there in silence. Known as ifonga, it is the traditional form of atonement.
Archaeological evidence indicates that Samoa is the heart of Polynesia. It was from here that the other Pacific islands were settled. First the Marquesas, then Tahiti, Hawaii, the Cook Islands, and finally New Zealand. Whether these migrations were deliberate or accidental is a mystery scholars are still trying to uncover. When Samoans started leaving 2,600 years ago to find homes in other islands, they took their culture with them. An important part of this culture was tattooing, which identifies the passage from adolescence to adulthood. The tattoo extends from the ribcage to the knees and is a mark of manhood, prestige, and beauty. Sharp needles of shark's teeth pierce the skin and deposit a fluid made from the soot of ground candle nuts. It is an extremely painful experience.
Females of high rank would also have a tattoo. It is called malu, meaning the tattoo is hidden and only uncovered on ceremonial occasions. It covers the lower thighs and knees. Taupo titles connect important families and villages throughout Samoa.
The Polynesians made frequent voyages between islands. Samoans were often invited to Tonga as master boat builders and to design burial grounds for royalty. Many Tongans sold Samoan girls as wives. At various times, the kings of Tonga resided in Samoa. But as Tongan influence grew in the 1300s, the Samoans began to rebel. Tutonga Talaiwhi'i was expelled, and as he fled, called out to the Samoan warriors, "Ua malia toa, ua malia tau, brave warriors, great fighters." Thus was established one of Samoa's highest ranking and oldest titles, malia toa, brave warrior. This title is currently held by Samoa's head of state.
It was 1722 when Samoa's history took a major new direction with the arrival of the Papalangi, the sky piercers. First came the explorers, then the whalers and traders, and in 1830 came the first missionaries led by John Williams from the London Missionary Society. He arrived with 8 Polynesian teachers from Tahiti and Aitutaki.
Malietoa Vainu'upo accepted the new religion, and in turn, Christianity spread as village councils of chiefs and heads of families followed his example. To counter Malietoa's growing Christian prestige, his main rival at the time, Lilo Mayava, sought Wesleyan missionaries from Tonga. As word of the white man's God was taking root, factional squabbling intensified among the two major Samoan clans.
Traders from Britain, Germany, and the USA now began trickling into Samoa. One German firm flourished by trading high-grade cocoa and copra to Europe. A British consul was established in 1847. USA and Germany followed suit. Motivated by their own colonial ambitions, each foreign power supported different Samoan factions, with the inevitable consequence of a military build-up. While Samoa looked inward to the disputes over kingship, their fate was being sealed.
The hurricane of 1889 was seen by some as divine intervention. 6 American and German warships ready for battle in a beer harbor were sunk. A major confrontation had been averted.
In course of the next 11 years, the colonial powers continued to feud over their interests in Samoa.
Samoans, on the other hand, continued to argue over who should be their king. Most Samoans wanted Mata'afa Iosefo.
But the colonizing powers thought otherwise. It was during this time that the Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson was living in Samoa and came out strongly in support of Mata'afa.
I was a chief in Lotofanga. Tusitala became my friend. He often came to our village to talk with us. He soon became involved in the politics of all our islands. And with our future in mind, he studied all the sides of the province.
In 1898, despite petitions, the Chief Justice decided in favor of the young Malietoa Tanemofili as king. Later, Samoa was partitioned. The USA took over the Eastern Island Group and Germany the Western Group. Britain relinquished its claim to Germany in exchange for other Pacific colonies.
Samoans were never consulted. They were told that their first allegiance must now be to the German Kaiser. An intermediate position was created for Mataafa Yosefo, called Ali'isili, highest chief.
The German colonial policy was to acquire large-scale coconut plantations, and they effectively became competitors with the Samoans in the lucrative export of coconut oil.
Sun-dried, the interior of millions of coconuts becomes the copra of commerce.
But Samoans were also unhappy about the way the Germans were treating their customs. A resistance movement called Mawapule began in Savaii to reclaim Samoan traditional authority.
Fearing civil war, the Germans arrested the leaders and exiled them to the Marianas.
As they sailed out of Apihapa in 1909, their leader Lawaki Mamoena Mulaulu was not to know that he would never return. After 8 years, he was given permission to come home. But on the voyage back to his beloved Samoa, he fell ill and died.
The volcanoes of northern Savaii became active again. Molten lava poured into the sea and over several villages, destroying everything in its path. The fleeing villagers were put into boats and sailed to Upolu Island. The lava flow continued for 5 years. The people were resettled in 2 villages, Salamumu and Le'auva'a. More than 80 years later, new vegetation started to grow through the lava.
World War I. Britain instructed New Zealand to invade Samoa. The naval convoy reached Apia on the 29th of August 1914. A heavily armed landing party advanced and seized control without any resistance from the Germans. On the following day, the Union Jack was raised over Samoa. But it took until the end of the war for Samoa to become a mandated territory of the League of Nations, administered by New Zealand. Its administrators, however, were not always the most qualified for the job. Often they were former military men. Was a black year in Samoa's history. It was November when a New Zealand ship, SS Taluni, entered Apia harbour. Some of the passengers on board were infected with the Spanish influenza virus. Because of a bureaucratic bungle, normal quarantine regulations were ignored and the infected people disembarked.
Samoans had no resistance, and a virulent disease spread with lightning speed throughout the islands. there was little treatment and even less medical help. Those spared death were themselves often weakened by the illness and unable to bury their loved ones in accordance with cultural and religious practices. In most cases, the dead were taken from their homes to the roadside to await collection by trucks manned by convict labor. The corpses were destined for unmarked mass graves. It was the only way to cope with the soaring death rate and threat of other diseases.
New Zealand was slow to respond, and by the time aid arrived, the crisis had reached its peak.
Within 2 months, the epidemic took the lives of almost 25% of the population. For years to come, there remained unbearable grief and resentment in Samoan minds.
With New Zealand firmly in power, its economic policies now aimed at bringing Samoa to a cash economy. But when they tried to change the apportionment of customary lands and reduce the power of the Matai, Samoans opposed the moves. These new foreign policies ran counter to Wha Samoa and its chiefly system.
Coupled with painful memories of the flu epidemic, Samoans decided to move in a new direction. It became the seeds of a peaceful, nationalistic resistance movement in the mid-1920s and became known as the Mau, literally, the opinion of the Samoans. Its slogan, Samoa mo Samoa, Samoa for Samoans, was a call for New Zealand to leave.
The administrators' response was to use the 1922 law, which gave them the right to remove Matai titles. Mau prisoners were rounded up by the New Zealand Marines and taken to the wharf. Some were exiled to New Zealand, some to other parts of Samoa.
About 80% of the population came out in support of the movement. Holders of the highest ranking titles, the Tama'aina, became its leaders. A campaign of civil disobedience began. Government orders were ignored and schools boycotted. Ripening coconuts were allowed to rot as both sides tried to outsmart the other.
The tension continued for 2 years and finally snapped at Beach Road Pier on the 28th of December 1929. Led by brass bands, over 1,000 Mau supporters marched into a pier from their villages to welcome 2 Mau members returning from exile in New Zealand. As the procession reached the courthouse, New Zealand police stepped in to arrest the secretary of the Mau. The marchers immediately set upon them. Armed reinforcements started firing into the procession. 1 policeman and 11 Samoans were killed. Among them was Tupua Tamasese Lealofi III, leader of the Mau. As he lay dying, he pleaded, My blood has been spilled for Samoa. Do not dream of avenging it. Peace must be maintained at any price.
From here on, the struggle escalated. New Zealand brought in more forces to capture those Mau who had escaped into the bush. And a gypsy North Sea plane was sent out to hunt down the fugitives.
For 2 months, the Mau easily eluded the Marines. The women maintained resistance activities and secretly passed food to their husbands and brothers in the mountains.
Administrator Allen declared wearing of the Mau uniform illegal and had the white bands forcibly removed from the lava-lavas. New Zealand forces now embarked on a series of village raids in their search for Mau supporters.
Mataafa from Wina Fiamne Mulin the First somewhat reluctantly took over leadership of the Mau and acted as their spokesman until 1935, when New Zealand had a change of government.
The Labour Party had always maintained support for the Mau, and with Michael Savage as Prime Minister, they allowed the Mau to exist as a lawful organisation. A goodwill mission to Samoa was ordered for the following year. In another bold move, Labour repealed the exile of Taisio F. Nelson, the original spokesman for the Mau. He had been twice exiled, and after 8 years there was great celebration on his return.
In the 1936 elections for the Fono of Faupuli National Assembly, Mau supporters won 36 of the 39 seats. But the reforms initiated by the Goodwill Mission were delayed when World War II broke out. New Zealand was once again defending global peace on the other side of the world.
Offshore, a Sunderland flying boat touches down, bringing the United Nations mission to Samoa. New Zealand still has full jurisdiction over Western Samoa. And so, when a petition for self-government was received from Western Samoa, UNO decided to send a mission of 3 representatives to make investigations. The mission will receive petitions, meet the island's leading citizens, and examine local conditions. The Samoan people are recognizing the need for political independence, but there's no question of challenging the world authority of the United Nations. Having presented their petition, the 3 ruling chiefs leave the headquarters. These chiefs represent the leading families of Samoa, and they've asked that their council of 3 should head an independent government.
By the end of the war, the United Nations once more placed Samoa under New Zealand control until they deemed Samoa ready for independence.
Greetings from the United Nations, which, as you know, is a kind of a phono of the whole world.
Again, Samoa's future had been decided in Europe without their knowledge, and there was anger at home. Nevertheless, Samoa decided to cooperate in order to achieve their aim for independence. Constitutive Assembly was created, and the Constitutional Convention of 1954 decided that only Matai could be parliamentary candidates and vote in elections. In 1959, the office of Prime Minister was established and Mataafa Faumuna Mulinu II elected. The next year, Samoan customs were enshrined in the new constitution. Provision was made to elect Samoans of mixed descent who chose not to hold Matai titles. In order to uphold the dignity of the Matai system and maintain unity, holders of the Tama Ainga titles from Sa Malietoa and Sa Tupua families were appointed to the highest positions. All Samoans can trace allegiance to either or both of these families. Thus, Malietoa Tanumafili II and Tupua Tamasese Meaole would become joint heads of state for life, and Tui Maleli Fano Suatipatipa, deputy head of state.
The United Nations now ordered a plebiscite on independence. It was opposed by Samoan leaders who said the Matai spoke on behalf of their people. However, they bowed to the will of the UN. In the words of Tupua Tamasese, if that is the way to independence, we must go through with it.
Plebiscite Day, and polling begins at the central office of the government of Western Samoa in Apia.
In May 1961, the plebiscite asked the public two questions. One, did they accept the draft constitution? And two, did they want Samoa to become an independent nation on the 1st of January 1962? The majority voted yes to both questions, thereby satisfying all UN criteria for the granting of self-government.
January the 1st, 1962, and with the new year comes the first independent Polynesian state of the 20th century, Western Samoa. His Highness Prince Tungi of Tonga arrives at Apia to take part in the celebrations and is greeted by the Prime Minister, Mataafa. On the Malaya Turfao, the heads of state, their Highnesses Tupua Tamasese and Malietoa Tanumafili, walk to the official dais, where the oath of office is to be taken before the Chief Justice of Samoa, Mr. C. Masak.
Now, on behalf of the head of state, and with a full sense of the historic meaning of my act, I formally declare open the first session of the first Parliament of the independent state of Western Samoa. So it for. Alo bala wina fa alo wina. Tato au fa tasu ne yas. Le mamalu ol kono fa tu la kono. Yes, so it for.
After 62 years of German and New Zealand rule, Samoa finally regained its political freedom. Apia became a city of celebrations.
From the Kingdom of Tonga comes a breathtaking gift of 1,000 yards of tapa cloth, made specially for the occasion.
Orators thanked our leaders and ancestors for years of patience and carefully weighed decisions that had made this day possible. Pastors gave thanks to God for the spiritual guidance and wisdom of our leaders and cautioned all citizens to remain true to the country's motto, Samoa is founded on God. Within 1 year of achieving independence, Tupua Tamasese Mea Ole passed away and Malietoa Tanumafili II became sole holder of the office. He is now the world's longest-serving head of state. The next holder will be elected by Parliament for a 5-year term.
Samoa joined the United Nations, the British Commonwealth and the Pacific Forum. It has a High Commissioner in New Zealand and Australia and an ambassador in Brussels and the USA. Diplomatic relations have been established with many countries abroad. Ties with Britain were further consolidated when the Duke of Edinburgh visited Samoa with Earl Mountbatten.
The last 200 years have brought immense changes to the whole Pacific area, and life in the islands of Polynesia will never be quite the same again. However, it is obvious that here in Samoa, the best of the old way of life and the advantages of the new have been happily welded together.
I wish to announce to you the important news that the Holy Father, Pope Paul VI, has decided in favor of a visit to the independent nation of Western Samoa in order to honor through this visit the peoples of the Pacific and the heroic missionaries who have spent their lives in the service of these peoples.
No pontiff had ever set foot on South Pacific soil. The Pope traveled to Lulumunga village for outdoor mass. 135 years had passed since the first Catholic missionaries, the Marist brothers, had arrived. Bishop Pio Taufinu'u was later to become the first Polynesian-appointed cardinal. When modern Samoa established its first central government in 1873, its parliament house, Mautafono, was built on a chiefly meeting place at Mulinu'u. It still stands as a reminder of the country's colonial past. To mark the 10th anniversary of independence, a new Mautafono was built close to the original one, which had served Samoa for 99 years. Designed by a Canadian architect, the roof retains the shape of a Samoan fale.
Ile upua polesh e fai o le fale a le ano a fale o le ano a fale o le uta ma le tofa
History was made in the 1976 elections when the newly appointed Prime Minister did not hold a Tama'ainga title. And the trend continued. Universal suffrage was introduced in 1991 and served to control the sharp increase in Matai titles. Until then, only Matai had the right to vote. The first female member of parliament was appointed to cabinet in the same year.
In the latter part of the century, aspects of the culture started to adapt to the shifting patterns of modern living. At ceremonial events such as building dedications, weddings or funerals, the presentation of food, sua, is still practiced. However, traditional foods are now often replaced with Western goods. Canned fish for cooked pigs, corned beef for chicken, biscuits in place of talo, cola for coconut milk, and a piece of cloth in lieu of siapu. The traditional Samoan fale has almost totally disappeared, and most houses are now built with cement, wood and corrugated iron. Vautasi is no longer the main means of sea transport. But it is a major sport. Of the trend to westernization, some churches have introduced Samoan custom into parts of their service. Tanoa, taupo, talking chiefs, and fine mats are symbolically included in worship. Samoans remain passionate about Samoa. The Matai system is maintained wherever Samoans gather together, at home and abroad. As a Matai once said, Samoan culture will only die when all Samoans die.
Okay, let's have a look.
Before the National University of Samoa was opened in 1984, Samoans had to travel abroad for further studies. They can now achieve first degrees in arts, science, commerce, education and nursing in Apia. A polytechnic also provides training for many trades. Degrees in theology and divinity are offered at the Methodist and Congregational Christian Church colleges, where principals and most academic staff are Samoan. These colleges were first established in the mid-19th century as training institutions for pastors and their wives. Samoans believe that taking care of one's elders earns blessing. The Whaasamoa includes care of the aged in the extended family structure. But with the new demands of modern living, not all families are able to provide this care. And so was established an old people's home in Mapuiwhangalele, which became the first of its kind, wherein the elderly are cared for by the little sisters of the poor.
In keeping with the revolution in global telecommunications, the strong demand for mobile phones has expanded well beyond the commercial sector and has become a popular item for home use. Television sets, telephones and refrigerators are no longer novelties, since electricity now reaches every village. And computers, faxes and the internet are also gradually making their way to the villages. Most noticeable, however, is the sharp increase in motor vehicles. It's a giant step from 50 years ago when people traveled in groups by longboat or walked from villages to a pier and back. Public transport and new roads have cut the isolation of even the most remote areas. As in days past, subsistence farming is still the major way of life in rural Samoa. It exists alongside an enlarging cash economy, supported by remittances from Samoan families living overseas.
The country's natural resources have been harnessed to become what is now a feature of Samoa's major industry, tourism. Its genesis lies in the 1940s, when the American Marines built Whaleolo Airport to support their defense of the islands against the threat of a Japanese invasion. From a small tin shed and grass runway beginning, it is today an international airport. And whilst economic development is important, Samoa's tourism is carefully monitored to protect its customs and traditions. Aggie Gray was a living legend of Samoa and its fledgling tourism industry. From humble beginnings in the 1940s as a hamburger bar, Aggie Gray's developed into the largest hotel in the country and is famous worldwide. By the 1990s, Samoa once again found itself in the path of two natural disasters, Cyclones Orpha and Bell. They damaged most villages throughout the country. The idyllic village of Papa on Savai'i Island was completely destroyed. Houses, plantations, and vegetation disappeared overnight. People sought refuge inland and anywhere they could dig in for cover. The balance of marine life, on which much of Samoan's subsistence living depends, was gravely affected. It took almost 5 years for the government and the people of Samoa to rebuild the country and revive its economy.
Sport is a passion among Samoans. They made history in 1993 when they won the 7-a-side World Rugby Final against rivals Fiji. And Samoa's pride Manu Samoa made lasting and vivid impressions on the sporting world during 3 Rugby Union World Cup competitions. Wales will never forget the power and force of the Samoan tackle. David Tua made New Zealand his adopted country, but has taken Samoa to the heights of the boxing world. And Samoan athletes have been competing in the Olympic Games since 1984. The Christian significance of the new millennium was celebrated throughout Samoa.
Samoa! Ula-ulaunga ila solgay al koyason sen kuli. Leo au kaukarikongu. Ole fafao sa uli. Ole ele o kufkafoe.
These islands were the last place in the world to see the fading light of the outgoing millennium.
Samoa's firstborn of the 21st century will forever be a symbol of human prosperity and fertility. The heart of Polynesia lives on.
Ua no fale ya satu ya maampa ia sa wo Samoa. Iona tulanga falupe. Ile etapua i o songa il malitoa tan mafili le lua o le au mamalu o le tatou malo.
Samoa's pride in its people and wane. Faith in the wisdom of elders is a religion that has survived for 3,000 years. As a scholar once put it, Samoa is an island whose shores may be invaded by foreigners, but whose heartland will never be conquered.